New polls show increasing support for impeachment. A CBS poll shows 55% support an impeachment inquiry by the House of Representatives. A Quinnipiac poll shows 47% support impeachment and removal from office of President Trump. 47% oppose impeachment and removal from office. Just last week, that same poll showed only 37% support for impeachment and removal from office. And joining us now, a polling expert, David Plouffe. He was the campaign manager for Senator Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign, and he was White House senior advisor for President Barack Obama. He is also the host of the new podcast from Cadence 13 called Campaign HQ, which takes you inside presidential campaigns. No one knows more about that than David Plouffe. David, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I want to get your reaction to this huge swing in the Quinnipiac poll on impeachment. It was 37% in favor just a week ago. Now that's up to 47. Just an incredible flip.
Well, Lawrence, thanks for having me. I think that, as citizens and voters learn more about the goings-on, we learned today now Australia is dragged into the conspiracy. I think they believe an inquiry is appropriate. I would caution everyone, though, to understand that, Donald Trump and his campaign are going to try and leverage this for maximum impact, too. They're running ads all over YouTube and Facebook, very effective ads, trying to find new supporters, register new voters. So I think that we don't know yet what's going to happen over the coming weeks. It may be those numbers get worse and worse for the president, and maybe we stay basically where we are. But make no mistake that Trump on the other side is going to try to leverage this for full impact. Now, of course, this wasn't part of his playbook to the extent he has one, heading into re-election, under the threat of impeachment. But they're going to try to make the best of it.
So this is something you haven't had to deal with as a campaign strategist, the opposing candidate possibly being impeached. How do you handle that in a presidential campaign? How do the Democrats handle that in the presidential campaign?
Well, it's important. Like Nixon and Clinton, our two most recent examples, were both in their second term. So Andrew Johnson went through this in his first term, but that was back in the 1860s. So it's hard to draw lessons from it. I guess, first of all, we have a bunch of candidates out there trying to win the nomination. And my suspicion is that impeachment is not going to drive our primary. I think folks are going to be looking for who can beat Donald Trump, because I don't think we should expect that he's going to be removed by conviction or by resignation, by election. So who can beat him? Who would be a good president? So obviously we do have a bunch of senators who may be, if this heads to trial, obviously in the spotlight, and maybe they'll have a great moment. But I think at the end of the day, when we get to Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, I don't think it's going to really drive who our voters pick to be our nominee. Of course, it could have a big effect on the general election. We just don't know that right now.
David, the most interesting thing I heard about what you were just saying was on your podcast with Senator Warren's chief strategist, who was talking about how her message on impeachment, which was that she simply read the Mueller report, made a decision, and this is where she is, was very much a part of the total fabric of the way she approaches issues. She takes in the information, she takes in the analytical information, the best information she can get, makes her decision. And so he was arguing, it seemed to me, on your podcast, that that impeachment actually is part of the entire Warren message.
Well, I think in terms of the way she takes in information and makes a decision, so there's a decisiveness that Joe Rospars, the chief strategist, was talking about, but also she's not alone in this, but she has been talking quite a bit about corruption throughout the entire. So, and I think that is going to be something that Trump is vulnerable to, whether it's Ukraine, but also the family corruption, the grifting, the benefiting of the Trump family. Voters in Wisconsin, in Iowa, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Florida, and Arizona, they don't like that, right? So I think just as I think we have to make a better case about the job loss under Trump. By the way, the two states in the country with the biggest manufacturing job loss over the last year, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. This is very important information. So you don't like the tweeting, you don't like the distractions, but you're losing jobs in your backyard, in your hometown, and you're dealing with really unprecedented corruption. So I'd imagine even before impeachment, corruption was going to be center stage in terms of the argument against Donald Trump in these battleground states, and I think that's only going to intensify now.
David, I have to squeeze in a final commercial break. When we come back, I want to ask you this difficult question. I certainly don't have any idea how to handle this, about how Joe Biden, as a presidential candidate, should be handling the way he and his family have been dragged into this presidential phone call with the president of Ukraine that's now the subject of an impeachment investigation. You got a minute to think that one over. We'll come back after the break. Back with us, President Obama's former campaign strategist, David Plouffe. David, how should Joe Biden and the Biden campaign handle Joe Biden and his family being dragged into that phone call by President Trump, the president of Ukraine, a phone call that's now the subject of an impeachment investigation?
Well, as outrageous as it is, and, Trump's got Giuliani kind of, who I think comes across more like a lunatic Seb Gorga figure these days than the former mayor of New York City, and all his henchmen trying to drag Joe Biden into this. I would use that obsession to your benefit. So obviously, Lawrence, your show, any podcast, a local or national, would have Joe Biden on, and I would use that obsession that Donald Trump sees to have with Joe Biden and be out there. And I know you're going to get tough questions, but that's what I would view as the best alternative here, is to really go out there and aggressively fill the space and basically, for a period of time anyway, become Donald Trump's general election opponent, here in September and October.
There's been, what we have seen are candidates like Beto O'Rourke stepping up and defending Joe Biden very strongly, very decisively. And that's kind of an interesting campaign dynamic. If you're the Biden campaign, do we just let them do it?
Well, again, and I think we'll see more candidates do that. But again, this is a very crowded field, and you're running against Donald Trump. For all of his faults, he's a showman extraordinaire. He wants to dominate the oxygen, and so this is an opportunity, I think, to go face to face with him. But I think this is an example of what whoever is our nominee is going to deal with this. I mean, what we saw in 2016 is going to be gentle by comparison. This is going to be brutal. It is going to be absolutely brutal, and that's why I think we need to see how our candidates deal with these tough situations through the rest of this year, early part of this year, how they deal with adversity, how they deal with challenge, even unfair things like this. Because we need someone who can not just win debates on policy points, raise more money than Donald Trump. We need somebody who can really go toe-to-toe with him. And he's clearly trying to enlist foreign governments all over the world to help him on this, and I'm sure we're going to see more of that.
David Plouffe, President Obama's winning campaign manager, is now the host of the new podcast, Campaign HQ. David Plouffe, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.